Sweat formed at the base of Randall Carter's neck as his jaw tightened. His fingers, which had been lazily tapping against his desk just minutes ago, froze mid-motion. His complexion, once smug and composed, shifted into something paler. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The air in the bank lobby seemed to thicken as every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance. Walking through the large glass doors were three sharply dressed individuals, exuding an aura of authority that silenced even the tellers whispering behind the counters. Their presence sent a jolt of electricity through the room, and in that moment, it was clear, Randall Carter, the bank manager, had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because the woman he had made wait for 2 hours, the one he had dismissed with passive indifference and barely concealed disdain, the one still seated in the plush chair near his office, was now standing, her arms crossed, and staring right at him with knowing eyes. And those board members, they were walking straight toward her. Randall's face drained of color. His lips trembled. This was not happening. It couldn't be. His mind raced back, desperately trying to piece together how he had gotten here, how things had spiraled into what was shaping up to be the single worst moment of his professional life. He had been in control. He had set the tone. So how had he ended up at the mercy of this woman he had treated like an inconvenience? And more importantly, who was she? 3 hours earlier. The sun shone brilliantly through the bank's floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished floors and sleek counters where customers were going about their business. It was a typical weekday afternoon, busy but manageable. Randall Carter leaned back in his chair, idly checking his watch. His desk was pristine, as it always was, organized with precision. A framed photo of his wife and 2 children sat in the corner, though he barely glanced at it anymore. The day was going smoothly, until she walked in. She was dressed in an elegant navy blue pantsuit, a structured leather bag slung over her arm. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup understated but flawless. There was an air of quiet confidence about her, the kind that commanded respect without demanding it. She approached the receptionist's desk with a polite but firm smile. "Good afternoon," she said. "I have a 1 p.m. appointment with Mr. Carter." The receptionist, a young woman who had only been working at the bank for a few months, hesitated for a second before nodding. "Of course. 1 moment, please." She picked up the phone, her voice hushed as she relayed the message to the bank manager's office. Behind the glass wall of his office, Randall Carter glanced at the monitor displaying the security feed of the lobby. His eyes flicked over the woman standing there, taking in the deep complexion of her skin, the sharpness of her attire, the poised way she held herself. A slow smirk crept onto his face. Another one. He had seen it before, black customers walking in, expecting to be treated the same as his preferred clients. They came in with their big ideas, their business plans, their investment dreams. But more often than not, they left disappointed. He had a system. A subtle system. One that didn't cross any lines but made it very clear who really mattered in his bank. He leaned over and pressed the intercom button. "Tell her I'll be with her shortly." The receptionist nodded and relayed the message. And then Randall let her wait. First 10 minutes. Then 20. Then 45. And still, she waited. But she didn't pace. She didn't fidget. She didn't even check her watch. She simply sat, composed, legs crossed, fingers lightly drumming against her bag as though she had all the time in the world. Randall found that irritating. At 1 hour and 15 minutes, he finally called his receptionist. "Tell her I'll need another 30 minutes. I have some urgent matters to attend to." By now, other customers had come and gone. Bank tellers had shifted in their stations. And still, the woman sat. Some of the employees were beginning to whisper. Randall ignored them. He would see her when he was good and ready. What he didn't know was that every second she sat in that chair was another nail in his coffin. What he didn't know was that this woman wasn't just anybody. And what he definitely didn't know was that he was about to lose everything. Randall Carter had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. He adjusted his tie, took another leisurely sip of coffee, and finally decided, after nearly 2 hours, to acknowledge the woman still waiting in his lobby. He pressed the intercom. "Send her in." The receptionist hesitated. For a brief second, Randall thought he saw something in her expression, an unease, a flicker of uncertainty, but he brushed it aside. It didn't matter. Within moments, the woman stepped into his office. Up close, she was even more composed than she had seemed in the lobby. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. Her presence was striking, not loud, not confrontational, but powerful in a way that made Randall uncomfortable. He didn't offer his hand. "Miss." He let the question hang. The woman's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Danielle." "No last name. Just that." Randall gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." She didn't move right away. Instead, she studied him for a moment, as if weighing her next move. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she took the seat. "So," Randall said, forcing a pleasant tone, "how can I help you today?" Danielle set her bag down carefully. "I believe the bank received my proposal 2 weeks ago." Randall suppressed a sigh. Of course. Another one of them trying to get a loan, an investment, a seat at a table they weren't invited to. He had seen this before. He had handled this before. He leaned back. "Right. I did review your proposal." That was a lie. He had barely glanced at it. "I have to say, it's ambitious." Danielle didn't flinch. "I prefer the term strategic." Randall chuckled, feigning amusement. "And you're looking for funding to expand your business?" "Yes." "What kind of business?" Danielle tilted her head slightly. "It's in the proposal." Randall didn't like that answer. It put him on the spot. Forced him to admit he hadn't read it. He gave a knowing smile, the one he reserved for situations like this. "Why don't you summarize it for me?" Danielle exhaled softly. "It's a multi-branch consulting firm specializing in financial literacy, business development, and wealth-building strategies." Randall raised an eyebrow. "Wealth building?" "Yes," she said smoothly. "For underrepresented entrepreneurs. Particularly black-owned businesses." Randall's smile barely wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. He glanced at her proposal, untouched on the corner of his desk, and reached for it, flipping through the pages as if just now considering it. "Well, Miss Danielle," he said, "I have to be honest with you. These types of ventures are—" he searched for the right word. "Risky." Danielle didn't blink. "Are they?" Randall chuckled. "Statistically, minority-owned businesses face higher failure rates." Danielle's gaze didn't move from his face. "And who controls the statistics?" That made Randall pause for half a second, but he quickly recovered. "It's just business, Miss Danielle. It's not personal." Her expression didn't change. "I never said it was." Randall cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. "The bank has very specific guidelines for funding projects like these. Unfortunately, at this time, we're not in a position to move forward with your request." Danielle leaned back, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "You haven't even looked at the financials." Randall's jaw tensed. She was calling him out. "Well," he said, reaching for his usual script, "I can assure you that—" Danielle cut him off. "Let me save you some time, Mr. Carter. The firm has a valuation of over $10 million. It's debt-free. We have a 5-year track record of exponential growth. And last year alone, we helped over 200 businesses scale beyond 6 figures." Randall blinked. That was not what he had expected. "I see," he said carefully. Danielle crossed her legs. "Do you?" Randall forced a chuckle. "Well, I must say, that's impressive. But—" "I was willing to wait for this meeting, Mr. Carter," Danielle said, her tone cool but firm. "And I had every intention of handling this professionally. But what I won't do is let you waste my time." Randall's fingers twitched slightly on the desk. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't the one in control. Danielle stood. "I'll be taking my business elsewhere," she said smoothly. "It's clear this bank isn't the right fit." Randall forced a polite smile, though his jaw was tight. "I'm sorry to hear that." Danielle reached for her bag. "Oh, I'm not." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door. Randall exhaled, relieved to have this over with. He had dodged that one, barely. But then, just as Danielle reached the threshold, she paused. She glanced back at him, a knowing glint in her eye. "By the way," she said casually, "I believe you have some board members arriving today." Randall stiffened. "What?" Danielle smiled. I hear they're making some major decisions about the bank's future. Randall swallowed. How do you know about that? Danielle tilted her head. Oh, she said lightly. I have my ways. And then she walked out. Randall's pulse pounded. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Because if she knew about the board members, that meant she wasn't just another client. She was something more. But what? And why did he suddenly feel like he had just made the worst mistake of his life? Randall Carter stared at the door long after Danielle had disappeared through it. His pulse was erratic, his mind racing. Who is she? The way she had spoken, so sure of herself, so unbothered, like she knew something he didn't. And then there was the way she had mentioned the board members. She hadn't asked. She hadn't speculated. She had known. Randall sat up straight, suddenly feeling the weight of his own arrogance. This wasn't good. He needed to figure out who she was. He reached for his keyboard, quickly typing her name into the bank system. Danielle. What? His fingers hovered over the keys. Damn it. He hadn't even asked for her last name. He muttered a curse and pulled up his email instead, searching for her original appointment request. There it was. Danielle Foster. The moment he hit enter, his stomach tightened. Her profile loaded, and within seconds, he realized just how big of a mistake he had made. Danielle Foster wasn't just some entrepreneur. She was a financial powerhouse. Her company, Foster Strategies and Consulting, was a rapidly expanding firm with contracts tied to major corporations, high-net-worth clients, and, Randall's breath caught, several banks. Including this one. Randall's blood turned ice-cold. Not only had he dismissed a multi-million-dollar business owner, but he had made her wait for 2 hours, patronized her, and denied her request without even reviewing her documents. And the worst part? Her name was already on the guest list for the board meeting today. Randall's mouth went dry. Danielle Foster wasn't here as just a client. She was here as a potential investor. A key investor. His stomach churned violently. He had screwed up. Badly. And now she was gone. Randall shot up from his chair, nearly knocking his coffee over. His heart was slamming against his ribs as he rushed out of his office, scanning the lobby. Where did she go? He barked at the receptionist. The young woman flinched. She left a few minutes ago. Randall muttered a curse under his breath. He turned on his heel, pacing back toward his office, his mind spiraling. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe if he could speak to the board members first, he could explain himself. Convince them that this was all just a misunderstanding. Yes, that's what he'd do. But just as he turned back toward his office, the sound of the bank's glass doors swinging open made his heart stop. They were here. 3 men and 1 woman walked in, dressed in immaculate suits, their presence sending an immediate ripple through the room. Bank tellers straightened their posture. Employees fell silent. Randall swallowed hard, forcing himself to walk toward them with a confidence he no longer felt. Mr. Langston, he greeted, extending his hand toward the older man leading the group. Philip Langston was the chairman of the board, a man whose approval meant everything. Langston shook his hand briefly but didn't slow his stride. Behind him, the other board members barely acknowledged Randall before making their way toward the conference room. Randall followed closely, trying to keep his voice steady. I wasn't expecting you so early. Langston didn't even glance at him. We wanted to make sure we had time to meet with our guest before the discussion begins. Randall's heart pounded. Guest? As if on cue, the receptionist's voice rang out from behind him. Miss Foster has returned. Randall froze. Slowly, he turned. And there she was. Danielle Foster walked back into the bank as if she owned the place. Poise. Confident. Untouchable. Randall could barely breathe as she walked past him without a second glance, heading straight for the board members. Philip Langston's face lit up the moment he saw her. Danielle. There you are. He stepped forward, shaking her hand warmly. We're so glad you could make it. The pleasure is mine, she replied smoothly. Randall could only watch in horror as Langston gestured for her to follow them into the conference room. Just before disappearing inside, Danielle turned, finally looking at Randall. And the smile she gave him, It wasn't smug. It wasn't arrogant. It was calculated. It was the look of someone who had just won. And Randall had just lost everything. Randall's stomach twisted as he stood frozen in place, watching the conference room doors close behind Danielle and the board members. His world was unraveling faster than he could process. His mind screamed at him to do something, but what? He couldn't barge into that meeting, not now. That would make things worse. Much worse. No, he needed a plan. He needed to think. He forced himself to walk back to his office, each step heavier than the last. As soon as he shut the door, he collapsed into his chair, running a hand down his face. How did this happen? One moment, he had been in control, confident, untouchable. The next, he was drowning in the consequences of his arrogance. He had underestimated her. And now, she was sitting with the very people who controlled his future. Randall inhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. He needed to know what was happening in that meeting. He stood abruptly, his pulse racing, and walked toward the large window overlooking the conference room. The glass was tinted just enough to obscure details, but he could see their silhouettes. Danielle was speaking. The board members were listening, intently. Langston nodded at something she said, then exchanged glances with the others. Randall's chest tightened. This wasn't just a meeting. This was deliberation. A cold sweat broke out along his forehead. He needed to act, fast. Inside the conference room, Danielle remained composed, her expression calm and professional. She had played this game before. She had seen men like Randall Carter before. And she had beaten them before. She sat across from Philip Langston and the other board members, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Miss Foster," Langston said warmly. "Your firm's reputation speaks for itself, and we've been eager to discuss the next steps." Danielle gave a small nod. "Likewise. I believe this partnership could be mutually beneficial." Langston leaned forward slightly. "Let's talk about your experience here today." Danielle held his gaze, not hesitating for a second. "I arrived for my scheduled appointment at 1 o'clock, she said. I waited, and waited, for nearly 2 hours. The room went silent. Langston's brow furrowed. "Excuse me." Danielle tilted her head. "Mr. Carter knew I was here. He deliberately made me wait. And when we finally spoke, he hadn't even reviewed my proposal." The woman on the board, Cynthia Monroe, exhaled sharply. "Unacceptable." Langston's jaw tightened. "Are you certain?" Danielle reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen, then turned it toward them. The recording played. Randall's voice. "These types of ventures are risky. Statistically, minority-owned businesses face higher failure rates. I can assure you that." Danielle's voice interrupted in the recording. "Let me save you some time, Mr. Carter." The weight of the conversation settled over the room. Langston's expression darkened. The other board members exchanged glances. Randall Carter had just sealed his own fate. Langston turned to his assistant. "Call him in." Randall's heartbeat pounded as the intercom on his desk crackled. "Mr. Carter, the board would like to see you in the conference room." Immediately. His blood ran cold. This was it. With shaking hands, he adjusted his tie, smoothed his suit jacket, and forced his legs to carry him toward the room. The moment he stepped inside, the energy shifted. The board members weren't smiling. Danielle sat with quiet authority, unreadable but undeniably powerful. Randall felt his throat tighten. Langston gestured toward the empty seat across from them. "Have a seat, Mr. Carter." Randall swallowed hard and obeyed. Langston leaned forward, his expression hard. "Would you care to explain yourself?" Randall's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. Would you have handled this situation differently if you were in Danielle's shoes? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping stories. Randall Carter's palms were slick with sweat as he struggled to find his words. Every eye in the conference room was on him, waiting. The silence was suffocating. Langston's fingers drummed against the table, slow and deliberate. "Well," Randall swallowed hard. I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Danielle gave a soft, knowing chuckle. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just enough to make Randall's skin prickle. Langston's expression didn't change. "A misunderstanding?" Randall forced a weak smile. "Miss Foster's claim that she was made to wait 2 hours is—" Danielle spoke before he could finish. "Documented." Randall froze. She placed her phone on the table, tapping the screen once. A log of her calls, time-stamped texts, and even a screenshot of the bank's automated system showing her appointment time flashed across the screen. The evidence was undeniable. Randall's throat tightened. "This," he let out a strained chuckle, forcing composure. "This is completely unnecessary. If I had known, if you had known who I was." Danielle cut in smoothly. Randall's mouth clamped shut. A beat of silence stretched between them. Danielle leaned forward, her expression cool. "That's the real issue, isn't it, Mr. Carter? You didn't see my business. You saw me, and you assumed I wasn't worth your time." Randall shook his head quickly. "That's not true." Langston raised a hand, silencing him. "We listened to the recording," Langston said, his tone unreadable. "The things you said. Do you realize the liability this places on the bank?" Randall's stomach churned. Langston turned toward the other board members. "Our institution prides itself on inclusivity and fairness. But this—" he gestured toward Danielle's phone. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that can destroy our reputation." Cynthia Monroe, the sharp-eyed woman seated next to Langston, finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, do you understand how bad this looks? Not just for you, but for all of us." Randall's lips parted, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew. He knew exactly how bad this was. And Danielle? She wasn't done. "I walked into this bank prepared to invest, not just as a client but as a partner," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "I came in with capital, experience, and a strategy that could have benefited both of us." Randall felt the blood drain from his face. Danielle shifted her gaze to Langston. "But I won't invest in a place that allows men like Mr. Carter to dictate who gets access to financial opportunities and who doesn't." A heavy silence followed her words. Randall's vision blurred at the edges. He could feel the room slipping from his grasp. Langston sighed, shaking his head. "This is a disaster." He turned to Randall. "Effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave while we conduct an internal review." Randall's breath caught in his throat. "No," he blurted out. "No, you can't." Langston's eyes darkened. "I can. And I just did." Randall felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Danielle stood, smoothing out the fabric of her blazer. "Well," she said, slipping her phone back into her bag. "I think that concludes this meeting." Langston and the board members rose as well, following her lead. Cynthia Monroe turned to Danielle. "We'd still love to discuss opportunities with you. Under better circumstances." Danielle offered a small smile. "We'll see." Randall sat frozen in his chair as they filed out, leaving him alone in the silent conference room. His career, his power, it was slipping through his fingers. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Randall sat in stunned silence, staring at the empty chairs around the conference table. His ears were ringing. His mind was struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Administrative leave. Those words echoed in his head like a death sentence. He gritted his teeth, gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was Randall Carter, the man who dictated who got ahead and who didn't. And now, in the span of a single meeting, he had gone from the bank's gatekeeper to a cautionary tale. His jaw clenched. This was her fault. Danielle Foster. She had set him up. Randall shot up from his chair, nearly knocking it over. He stormed out of the conference room, his pulse hammering in his throat. He needed to fix this. He needed to do something. He rushed down the hall toward Langston's office, ignoring the looks from employees who had clearly already heard the news. The whispers were growing. The tellers were watching. They could smell blood in the water. He reached Langston's door and rapped his knuckles against it urgently. No answer. He knocked again, harder. "Philip, please." "Mr. Carter." Randall froze. He turned slowly, and there she was. Danielle Foster stood at the end of the hallway, one hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something behind her eyes, something knowing. She had seen this play out before, and she wasn't the least bit surprised. Randall straightened his tie, forcing himself to regain some sense of composure. He had to find a way to flip this. He had to make her understand, no, convince her, that this was all a mistake. He stepped toward her, lowering his voice. "Miss Foster, may I have a word?" She didn't blink. A bit late for that, don't you think? His nostrils flared, but he forced a polite smile. "Look, I'm willing to admit I may have misjudged you. Let's not make this bigger than it has to be." Danielle tilted her head, studying him. "Bigger," she repeated, arching a brow. "Mr. Carter, what part of this do you not understand? You didn't just misjudge me. You made an active decision to ignore me, diminish me, and dismiss me." Randall's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "I'm prepared to make things right," he said through gritted teeth. Danielle let out a quiet laugh. "Are you?" Randall forced himself to nod. "I'll personally review your proposal." Danielle sighed and took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "I don't need you to review my proposal," she said coolly. "I needed you to do your job. And you didn't." Randall's pulse throbbed in his temple. "You're making a mistake." Danielle's smile was sharp. "No, Mr. Carter. You did." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. For the first time in his career, Randall Carter was powerless. And it burned. Randall Carter didn't go home that night. He sat in his office long after the bank had closed, staring at the dim glow of his computer screen. His mind was a mess, his thoughts ricocheting between anger, desperation, and disbelief. This isn't happening. It couldn't be. He had built his career on control, on making the rules, setting the tone. He had been untouchable. Until now. Now, everything was crumbling because of her. Danielle Foster. A woman he had brushed off as insignificant had just undone everything. Randall gritted his teeth and opened his email. His hands shook as he scrolled through the messages piling up in his inbox. Some were from clients, others from employees, but the ones that sent a chill down his spine were from corporate headquarters. The subject lines alone made his breath catch. Urgent. Pending investigation. Immediate review of management conduct. Statement required regarding Miss Foster incident. Randall felt sick. They were serious about this. His finger hovered over the mouse, and without thinking, he clicked open the last email. It was from Philip Langston. "Randall, we need to talk first thing in the morning. The board is deliberating next steps. I'd advise you to prepare a statement and be ready to answer some difficult questions. Philip Langston." Randall slammed his laptop shut, his heart hammering. He had seen this happen to others before. When corporate started talking about next steps, it never ended well. And if they were asking for a statement, that meant they were covering their bases, getting ready to make a decision. A decision that could very well cost him his job. He pushed himself away from his desk and stood, pacing the length of his office. He had worked too hard for this. He wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. But what could he do? He couldn't erase what had happened. He couldn't undo the recording. And worst of all, Danielle Foster had won. Unless... Randall paused mid-step, his mind shifting gears. There had to be a way out. A way to shift the narrative. A way to fix this. He needed leverage. Something he could use. His eyes darted to his filing cabinet. His fingers trembled as he yanked open the drawer, shuffling through documents, searching. Then, he found it. A file marked confidential, Foster Strategies and Consulting. His pulse quickened. He pulled it out and flipped it open, scanning the contents. There had to be something, anything, he could use to regain control. And then, he saw it. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. There it is. He had one last move to play. The next morning, Randall Carter walked into the bank with a new sense of purpose. He was a man on the brink of disaster, but he wasn't out yet. He had found something, a detail buried in Danielle Foster's file. A sliver of leverage. And if there was one thing Randall knew how to do, it was survive. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and stepped into the conference room where the board was waiting. Langston sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Cynthia Monroe and the other board members watched him carefully. But it was Danielle Foster, calm, collected, and utterly unbothered, who unnerved him the most. Randall took his seat. He wasn't going down without a fight. Langston cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, we've reviewed the situation thoroughly. Your actions yesterday were not only unprofessional but have placed this institution in a precarious position." Randall folded his hands together. "I understand that. And I take full responsibility for any misunderstandings." Cynthia Monroe scoffed. "Misunderstandings?" She shook her head. "We have a recording, Mr. Carter." Randall took a slow breath. "I recognize that. But before any final decisions are made, I believe there's something the board should be aware of." Danielle's gaze didn't waver, but Randall swore he saw the slightest flicker of curiosity. He slid the folder forward. "This," he said, tapping the file, "is a document detailing previous loan applications associated with Foster Strategies and Consulting." He let the words sink in. "Including a rejected one." Cynthia frowned. "And?" Randall leaned back, feigning confidence. "Miss Foster's business was denied a loan 3 years ago. Different bank. Different circumstances. But a similar situation." He turned toward Danielle, watching for a reaction. "Interesting pattern, isn't it?" Langston's brow furrowed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Randall smirked. "I'm suggesting that perhaps there's more to this story. Maybe I was right to be hesitant about her proposal. Maybe the concerns I raised weren't as unfounded as they seem." For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed Danielle's face. Randall felt a rush of satisfaction. "Got you. But then..." She laughed. Not a nervous chuckle. Not an awkward scoff. A genuine laugh, low, amused, confident. Randall's stomach twisted. Danielle reached for the file, flipped it open, and turned it toward the board. "This..." She smiled, shaking her head. "This was a strategic decline." Randall blinked. "What?" Danielle tapped the document. 3 years ago, I applied for a business loan not because I needed it, but because I wanted to test the bank's evaluation process. And do you know what I found?" She leaned forward, her voice smooth as silk. "Bias." Randall stiffened. Danielle looked around the room. "I turned that rejection into an independent audit, which exposed serious discrepancies in loan approvals for minority-owned businesses. That bank..." She gave a knowing smile. "They ended up settling in a quiet but very expensive lawsuit." Randall's mouth went dry. Danielle closed the file and slid it back toward him. "Did you really think I wouldn't be 10 steps ahead?" she asked. Randall's jaw clenched. He felt his last chance slipping through his fingers. Langston sighed and turned to the rest of the board. "I think we've heard enough." Cynthia nodded. "I agree." Langston turned back to Randall. His expression was final. "Mr. Carter, your actions have made it clear that you do not represent the values of this institution. Effective immediately, your employment with this bank is terminated." Randall felt the words like a punch to the gut. This was it. His career. His power. Gone. Danielle stood, smoothing out her blazer. "Thank you for your time," she said simply, as if this was nothing more than another business meeting. Randall watched, paralyzed, as she extended her hand to Langston. "I look forward to working with you," she said. Langston shook her hand. "Likewise." Randall barely registered the sound of chairs scraping back as the board members filed out. He sat there, numb, as his entire world collapsed around him. The last thing he saw before Danielle walked out of the room was the small, satisfied smile on her lips. She had won. And he had lost everything. What do you think about the way Danielle handled this situation? Do you believe Randall got what he deserved? Let us know in the comments. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more powerful narratives.